Okay, I think that's most people logged into the webinar. So welcome and good morning, everyone. My name is David Adams. I'm Emeritus Chair in Urban Studies at the University of Glasgow, and I'm also one of the Scottish Land Commissioners. So I'm very pleased to be chairing the webinar today. We're expecting over 100 attendees, representing a wide variety of expertise in the field. And that's reflected in our panel, who come from government, business, community, and voluntary sectors, and from the property, planning, housing, and regeneration professions. So we have wide expertise, and hopefully we'll be able to address the issues in front of us this morning. That actually makes my task as chair quite difficult, because we could veer off in all sorts of directions. So I've really been asked to keep us on the spot, and to ensure we do so, the organisers have usefully asked the speakers to address one of three topics. The first one, and the first session, is going to be how can the state achieve more homes and better places? We then move on in the second session to why local level action is vital in delivering better places. And we conclude with a focus on how can policy deliver practical change. Now, I'm going to do my best to keep the speakers focused on these questions. And you can help me do so by using the Q&A function. So please do post any questions you have from now onwards, and we'll do our best to address as many as possible. And the way we're going to proceed is we have 4 speakers in each session. I'm going to ask each speaker to give us 3 minutes of what they think are the key points. And we're then going to proceed into discussion between the speakers, and hopefully picking up the questions that you're raising yourselves. I guess one of the reasons I've been invited to chair the webinar this morning is 10 years ago, I co-authored a report for the Scottish Government entitled Delivering Better Places in Scotland, Learning from Broader Experience. And this research investigated 8 major case studies across Europe. And it identified 8 key elements to improving place quality in Scotland. So these are what we pinpointed in 2011. First, ensuring good leadership, then coordinating delivery, controlling the spatial development framework, achieving fast and coordinated regulatory approvals, exercising ownership power wisely, attracting funding for advanced infrastructure provision, securing design quality through procurement strategies, and thereafter continuing to invest and provide stewardship over time. Now, it seems to me there's a resonance here with many of the themes covered in the advanced videos for this event, which I hope you've been able to take a look at. So I guess my challenge to all the speakers is, in 10 years' time, are we still going to be talking about the same issues in the same way? Or will we be able to look back on a decade of really solid achievement on the ground? So without further ado, I'd like to move into our first session, where the question we're posing for the speakers is, how can the state achieve more homes and better places? So I'm going to introduce each speaker in turn before they commence. And our first speaker is Stephen Tolson. Stephen is a past chair of RICS in Scotland. He's a fellow of the institution and a registered valuation surveyor. He's had quite a varied career for one reason or another. He's been a property developer, professional planning consultant. He's written professionally and academically. In fact, Stephen and I have co-authored a piece recently. And he's done quite a bit of teaching at various Scottish universities, as well as currently serving as a trustee on a community-led regeneration project. So Stephen is going to bring us, I guess, a number of perspectives into what he's got to say. The floor is yours, Stephen, and welcome. And you have 3 minutes to your opening remarks for the session. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. Good morning to everybody. So I'll get cracking straight away. My first point is that we have a climate emergency. The National Planning Framework calls for a green wellbeing economy. To do this, we need to have the right houses in the right places. Scottish Government is promoting 20-minute neighbourhoods. How will these neighbourhoods be delivered? 20-minute neighbourhoods need high density, but is this the kind of place that the public will support post-COVID? And can neighbourhoods be retrofitted into the existing housing land releases? This is just not a housing matter, it's a place matter that needs more than a market as the delivering agent. So to achieve a 20-minute neighbourhood and a green wellbeing economy, the state needs more than policy. It has to act as the promoter and investor. My second point is that politicians and policymakers love numbers. We need 50,000 affordable homes, etc. But what types of homes are needed? On average, around 2 people live in a home in Scotland. But in the last 40 years, over 40% of new homes are detached family houses. Around 2/3 of Scotland's housing stock is under-occupied, and about 39,000 are lying empty. This mismatch between what we build and what we live is not efficient and it's not green. But it will challenge to persuade people to live in houses that are bigger than they require. An Age Scotland survey last year found that 36% of older people prefer to move house, but there's no choice. One house builder said to me that 16% of their sales go to retired people. If we're going to have a green wellbeing economy, it's vital that people have the right choice of home. It's not just the needs and aspirations of those in affordable housing, it's the requirements of the whole population. Market does not address the whole population. It's not their job. This is a matter for the state to determine and manage. My third point is about a greater choice of housing. Currently, delivery is too polarized. I'm of a retirement age and my wife and I would like to move house, but we never see anything suitable for our needs. The Age Scotland survey says there are some 360,000 older people want to move. To create wider choice, we need wider competition, allowing smaller developers and individuals to build homes for those that don't want a standard product. The Europeans do this all the time, with Germany and Scandinavian countries having around 60% of their new build delivered by self-build operations. It is the state that needs to liberate such an approach. Research shows that if we want public interest development, the state has to be the champion and lead by investing and delivering projects. This means being the place promoter, putting in infrastructure and widening participation. The market will not widen competition, it's not their motivation. Policymakers need to be more savvy on how markets function and what the state needs to do in order to shape markets in the right direction. We've done this before through new towns and urban development agencies. Clyde Gateway has done a pretty decent job as a market shaper, but if we're going to fix vacant and derelict land and make a green economy, then the state needs to get its hands dirty. Thanks for listening.
Thanks very much indeed, Stephen, for provoking us right at the start. I'm sure there's lots of questions that come on that, but we'll have contribution from each of our speakers and then have a panel discussion. So I want to move on and invite Dorothy McDonald to speak. Dorothy has been involved in planning for the whole of her career and is currently assistant manager in Glasgow and Clyde Valley Strategic Development Authority. She's a former member of the RTPI Scottish Executive Committee and a former head of the chair of the Heads of Planning Scotland Development Planning Group. And she has widespread expertise in regional and local development policy in housing and transportation. So the floor is yours, Dorothy, and you have 3 minutes just for your opening remarks, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for that introduction. And like Steve, I've got 3 substantive points to make. I should manage to keep the 3 minutes, and my focus is from my introduction, you'll appreciate, is about planning and particularly development planning's role. So firstly, numbers, Steve. Yeah, we do obsess about the numbers, but understanding the issues through evidence, that's my first substantive point, which you know, understanding what's going on there, working in this world of regional planning and the metropolitan city region, we need to really understand what's moving and shaking in terms of delivery. Maybe it sounds a bit banal and simplistic, but you know, understanding trends and patterns is useful. And for example, we have observed since the global financial recession a complete collapse in brownfield delivery in the private sector, and that's significantly different to what's happened to the social sector. Also for blindingly obvious reasons, but public sector finance and delivery works totally differently. So within the private sector, there's been a reasonable recovery in greenfield delivery, but that collapse in brownfield delivery still is there, and means that our development planning strategies really aren't quite working. Something else has to happen. So that was the first point, understanding the issues through evidence. Secondly, how can the state achieve more homes? We can do that by building them. Again, blindingly obvious, but through the More Homes programme, with funding and delivery commitment, stuff is happening. And in the Glasgow City region, in the 5 years before that funding commitment started delivering, and 5 years going forwards, up to about 23, we are going to see over a doubling in social housing delivery, going from about 7,500 units over the previous 5 years period to over 16,500 units over the next 4 or 5 years, almost 94% of which is on brownfield land, i.e. delivering those difficult sites that get stuck in regions. Also relevant to the social sector delivery is conditionality of funding. So that is going to continue to drive higher standards of delivery. And going forwards, consistent multi-year funding to maintain the skills and capacity for development that has been achieved will be helpful. So that was my second point on building homes directly. There's another angle to that as well, which I'm not going into too much, but down south there's quite a lot of initiatives around local house building companies where local authorities outsource to arm's length companies delivery. The third point is having the delivery tools. So in the case of this collapse in brownfield delivery, clearly more proactive intervention, state intervention is required. We need the leadership on these issues. We need the skills and resources, which we haven't always got. There's been a massive depletion in skills and resources in some of these areas. And in terms of development planning and the role of development planning, I think it's important, again, another obvious thing, but to recognise that development plans themselves don't do anything. They don't deliver anything. They provide the policy framework, policy context. Perhaps what we need to move into in terms of development planning is we have a tool called delivery programs or action programs in the old money. So perhaps it's costed delivery programs, and there's quite good examples of that in some authorities who are beginning to work more corporately around delivery of their development plan. We've got at our disposal, we've got master planning and development briefs to try and drive that quality. Land assembly, an awful lot of talk about that. The tools are essentially there. We need to do more in land assembly, particularly on those difficult stock sites. Direct funding, of course, and my final point, you know, whatever happened to good old-fashioned development planning and implementation teams? You just don't really hear that term very often. The other thing, the final comment would be that that kind of planning goes on in local authorities across a lot of services, across housing, across economic development, across regeneration teams and planning. Planning can provide that kind of policy context and kind of golden thread of activity driving towards the delivery of our overarching plans and strategies. Comments? Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Dorothy. That's again kept time, which is good. We're going to move straight on now to Tony Cain. Tony is the policy manager for the Association of Local Authority Chief Housing Officers. He's long experience within the housing field and has served as the director at local authority level. He's also a member of Shelter's Scottish Committee and has recently been appointed as an ordinary member of the first tier tribunal, the Housing and Planning Chamber. So from that perspective, Tony, can we offer you 3 minutes for your opening remarks, please?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm the old municipalist on the panel, and I intend to perform to type. I don't think I'm not sure it's about building more houses. I think it's about building enough houses. I think it's not clear that the houses that are being built are the right ones, or that they are good enough. And some of the points that Steve made tell on that. I think it's not clear that the people buying homes need the homes that they are buying, or the folk that do need to buy homes can buy the homes they want. And again, I think Stephen has made that point quite clearly. And actually, we already know how to build better places and better homes. All that information is there, and very occasionally we get it absolutely right. So we're not short of skills, we're not short of the understanding, and we're not short of the ability. What we're short of is the tools and the determination. So my 3 key points here, or my 3 things that we need to do, are pretty straightforward. First of all, we need to re-establish public policy as the primary driver in the housing development process. This isn't about anything other than ensuring that we deliver the housing that meets the needs of the population of Scotland. And that isn't something you leave to the private sector, and it isn't something you leave to the profit motive. It's a fundamental obligation of government to ensure that its population is properly housed. I think we need to empower and democratise planning, the planning process at a local level, and put communities in charge of the outcomes. I think there are huge issues with the way in which the planning system is gamed, particularly by the large developers, and we need to absolutely stop that. And finally, we need to give local authorities a preemptive right to acquire development land at existing use values. Absolutely give them control and the tools that they need to ensure that what goes up is exactly what is needed and is durable and will last for the appropriately over time, both in terms of its ability to meet needs, but also in the quality of place. And we need to stop settling for second best, which is where we have ended up.
Well, thanks very much. That's brought us up to speed and allowed more time for discussion and a provocative set of points. I'm sure that will stimulate discussion, and I'll be interested to see if we have a different perspective from Michaela, who's on next, because Michaela is the current chair of the Scottish Property Federation. She's had a varied career in the public sector, having previously been Assistant Chief Planner for Scotland, then working in the development industry for Forth Ports and Carla. So we're interested to hear your point of view from the private sector, Michaela. And again, 3 minutes, please, for your key points.
Thank you, Tony, and to all the other panellists for some very stimulating thoughts that have come forward so far. If I might add to them, I thought about this. Obviously, the challenge is to talk about what the state or public sector can do to deliver more homes and better places. And I found it quite hard to extricate the role of the public sector from everybody else's role. And I kind of considered this as a Venn diagram: more homes, better places. And I found there was a huge overlap in my Venn diagram to actually achieve this. And right in the middle, I put 2 things. One was change our attitude. And that means changing our attitude from the one that creates conflict that we have just now to a more cohesive approach to housing our communities. And the other was work in partnership. And to work in partnership, that involves understanding the nature of risk, because actually private house building takes on a huge amount of risk. There's risk in timing, planning, valuation, in the ground, in weather conditions, in overall cost risk, in sales risk, in pricing. And you know, local authority tendency is to say, well, you know, we want a Section 75 and we want all these things delivered up front with certainty. And if there was partnership, both in risk and reward, I think that would be better for everybody. So my points are, first, and I think it's been said already, but to stop micromanaging housing land and allocate land where people want to live. And that actually brings us into some really challenging issues around, do we jump the green belt and build carbon commuting settlements, or do we reimagine what green belt is with cores and wedges and so on, and try and expand our existing cities? You know, there's a brownfield greenfield debate, and all those things are really important. We need to recognize that people make the need for infrastructure. Development does not make the need for infrastructure, people do. So in order to actually deliver successfully, we need to consider how we fund infrastructure, because Section 75 can do some of it. Certainly, there's no doubt about that, but there's a much more collective responsibility that we need to take around infrastructure. We also need to reduce policy conflict, where we've got development plans that say we want really, really, really high density with really, 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 really large amounts of open space. And you can't actually deliver the two things on the same site. So, you know, that goes back to not micromanaging land, allocating enough land in the first place, and allowing the type of development that we actually want. We need to use partnership together to, for example, use CPO powers to make connections, because a developer can't always build a footpath across somebody else's land to connect a new development into the wider community. But the council could use CPO powers to make that connection. We need to be greener, and that involves the state actually considering where electricity comes from, how we generate it, and are we going to generate enough to allow the new homes that we build in the future and the heat of the existing ones to be greener. And finally, for me, I think we need to examine the whole nature of what community really is, and how we've developed this conflict-ridden system that we actually have in planning at the moment, where we've given communities rights, but with no responsibilities. And so what you find is that people who consider themselves the community in their detached houses on the edge of a settlement are actually objecting to new homes that might, for example, provide a home for the sofa surfing young mum with a baby in another part of the city. So, you know, all the people who are the community must get involved in development planning. And you know, we need to find a way of doing that, whether it's citizen panels or something like that, that's quite different from what we do now. Thank you.
That's excellent. Thanks very much indeed. So that has left us just short of 20 minutes from some discussion. Could I encourage you, please, to use the Q&A function? Can I encourage you, if there's questions there that you'd like asked, then just tick on the like box, and those that move up the screen we'll give priority to. But I want to start by picking up the issue of risk, which Michaela talked about. It was interesting that Dorothy talked about improving state's understanding of what's going on, which is obviously understanding and knowledge is an important part of reducing risk. But I want to pick up this idea that Stephen had about the status place promoter, place investor. And I'm going to ask him, can that reduce risk in the production process? And can it help by reducing risk to enable us to deliver more homes and better places? In other words, to what extent is risk a bugbear in everything that's going on? Stephen, what's your view on that?
Well, Dorothy said about in the connection of brownfield sites, so it only been done in the last 10, well, since the recession, so longer than 10 years, but it only been done by social housing providers and not by the private sector. And that is a function of the risk. And fundamentally, any house builder will tell you that they're never going to participate in a project where the costs of procuring a project are greater than the value that they get from it. And if they can go elsewhere, then that's what they'll do. And that's exactly what's happened. If you look at what's happened in previous times, I'm old enough to remember a few recessions, but we'll go back to say 1991. At that time when there was a recession, there was some fairly significant grant subsidies available from the state to support development in brownfield situations, and we saw that continuity. Right at that very time of 1991, there was a major redevelopment of the Gorbals called the Crown Street, and that was funded by the Scottish Enterprise and Scottish Homes with the assistance of Glasgow City Council. All that was happening, and all the developers were provided with what was called Grow Grant, for those that can remember. Now, we haven't had anything like that since the last recession. There is no significant grant available to developers for development action. The subsidy, where the subsidy is going, is direct to the individuals. So that we're missing the opportunity. The state's lost that additionality that they might get out of subsidy by directing it to individuals rather than activity on the ground, which then can be helped to subsidise the individuals coming in thereafter. So we've lost that opportunity. So the fundamental reason I think that we've got this risk factor, which has not been addressed, is the lack of subsidy to enable private sector investment in brownfield sites.
Okay, thank you. Do any of the other panelists want to add any comments to that one?
Can I just sort of agree with that, you know, there could be funding mechanisms that allow the kind of pump priming of sites in order to be able to bring them forward. And I think that's probably particularly in areas which are maybe not as market facing. I sort of take the point that's being made about brownfield development, but where brownfield is allocated in places that people really want to live and values can be generated, there's no impediment to brownfield land. And the developer that I used to work for the last, I think about 5 years, more than 2/3 of all homes that they built were on brownfield land. So, you know, if the right brownfield land still can come forward for development. And if brownfield land's identified and doesn't come forward, then Stephen's absolutely right. Some form of subsidy or other way of making that development work, reducing the risk, is essential.
Yeah, can I come in on that point as well? Yeah, Grow Grant of the past. Today we've got the Housing Infrastructure Fund, and we've got another thing called Partnership Support for Regeneration. But the hoops to jump through are rather complex, and perhaps it's targeted funding to areas that we know are not, Michaela's last term, they're market facing, you know, combined perhaps with the active CPO activities. There are areas where it's cheaper to buy them than it is to build them. It's as simple as that. So so nobody's going to be building new homes in those areas. But those are the areas where there are issues of equalities and deprivation, quality of general environment. And, you know, often these are areas where there's high levels of VDL, vacant and derelict land, and multiple issues of deprivation. These are the areas that we want to target and try and support in terms of housing delivery. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. I'm
Can
going to move on.
Can I offer an observation on the question of risk, if that's okay? Because I think one of the questions here is what we understand by risk and who is taking it. It's not obvious to me that the directors and shareholders of the major house building companies have been taking any risks at all over the last 15, 20 or 40 years. They've continued to make very substantial profits, and their share value has gone up at quite a rate. I think smaller developers, the SMEs and the people who work in the construction sector take a great deal of risk. And many of those folk who work on the tools, I mean, a typical career task, a career trajectory is after the third time of being made redundant, they go away and become a taxi driver. So it's how do we understand risk and who is taking it? And when it really goes pear-shaped, it's the public sector that picks up the risk, not the big development companies. So I think there's a big issue about de-risking the development process, but who benefits as we de-risk that process? And it should be the people that work in it, People who buy houses from the private sector take quite a big risk at the moment because the legal system around house purchases is loaded against them, and it's not obvious that the quality of the product that's being put on the ground is as good as it should be either. So there is something about unpicking what we mean by risk and simply not buying the development industry's particular version of it.
Okay, thanks, Tony. I think that's something to think about. I'm going to try now and move on to some of the questions being asked and picking up from the top of the list in terms of the ones people have selected. So David Stewart from the Scottish Land Commission says, Stephen has made an elegant case for the state to play a more active and interventionist role to shape markets to deliver houses and places Scotland need. What role does the panelists think that land reform can play in delivering more homes to better places? So I think what David is hinting towards is land reform in terms of reforming land markets, in terms of tackling market failure. Now, Tony, I'm going to bring you in first of all, because you had, in your opening remarks, you made a specific, what I would regard as a land reform proposal, which is to allow local authorities the preemptive right to acquire at existing use value. So I'm going to ask you for more of a justification as to why that change should be made, because there is, should we say, a slightly unhappy history of that kind of proposal. And I'm going to ask for any other views people have on the need to maybe quite radical changes in the way land markets work, and whether that in itself will have an impact on place quality and housing production. So, Tony, just say a little bit more about your suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, there are huge questions about land ownership and land use right the way across Scotland, in rural areas and in urban areas as well. And I'm not expert enough on it to kind of deal with the whole lot, but I think we need to acknowledge that the way in which land is owned and used across Scotland is deeply problematic in terms of the extent to which it is properly supporting and driving sustainable local and national economies. And so far as this is concerned, though, as a fundamental, I do not think that public policy decisions should be made in a way which simply benefits individuals. That's not that. In any other context, that would be simply corrupt. You know, the idea that the council makes a decision and one person gets rich off the back of that is hugely problematic. It may well be the case that in the UK we haven't been good at managing the land system and reforming land ownership, but things like land value capture is absolutely common practice across Europe, and we're pretty much unique in the sense that we leave the whole of the public policy uplift to the private sector. We don't seek to capture that in any systematic way. And the Section 75, Section 10, to be fair to the developers, it's a clumsy system. It's unclear, it's unpredictable, and it encourages gaming. And I don't think it's not fit for purpose in the way that it works at the moment. So I've set out a particular approach. It's pretty black and white because I think that helps promote a conversation. But my view is that the public sector needs to have greater control over the way in which land is released for development, and greater control over the way in which the value uplift that comes from fortuitously being the person that happens to own a piece of land at the point at which it's designated for development, the way in which that uplift in value is captured and redistributed. And I don't think the current situation where essentially the public sector is expected to pick up public realm costs, or rather the private sector works hard to ensure the public sector picks up as much of those costs as possible is a fair or reasonable way of doing it. So I think there's a much more detailed and more complicated conversation about how you reform the land process, but at the center of it is the simple fact that public policy, when it puts additional value on a piece of land, the public purse should be the one that benefit, or public policy should benefit from that directly and comprehensively, not the lucky individual who happens to own it off the back of, I don't know, the murder that was carried out by one of their ancestors in the dim and distant past at the behest of a king.
Okay, that again, no doubt will provoke further responses. Stephen, I want your reaction in a specific way. You mentioned self-build, and you mentioned how difficult it is in this country, as opposed to many countries, of actually finding a plot of land and building a house yourself. I mean, is that a failure of the land market? Why does that happen? Why is there not more self-build? And can land reform help us to get more self-built housing?
Well, setting aside, I think, can I just address the existing use value argument that's been put forward? I said earlier on that I was of retirement age, and those of retirement age have worked in property will be able to talk about the development land tax in the 1970s, which was a complete failure. And so rather than talking about a kind of theoretical notion about these things, as a surveyor, I would prefer to look at the practice, and the practice says it doesn't work. You have land, what was termed as land strikes, land was withheld, and so on. I think it's a jolly difficult thing to do, and it has a whole raft of issues in terms of human rights and so forth. So generally speaking, it's not, I don't think it's the way to go, particularly if you're looking to try and push for brownfield land, because existing use land value in brownfield is zero anyhow. So you're not capturing any value in any event. So sorry to nail that one, Tony, but that's kind of my response. And I'm pretty sure anybody in the private sector would share that view. As to the matter of self-built plots, I think my argument is that you can't do that in the context. It's kind of pretty arbitrary. There's nothing really in any local development plan which is going to support these things. It needs some kind of collective action, which is what happens in European practice. So the state would bring that forward and would allocate parts of sites for self-build, and not just in necessarily individual self-build, but collective self-build, as you can see in Germany, for example. It's a good building co-ops and things like that. So you can get co-housing as well as individual plots. So I think that has to be orchestrated. Individuals cannot possibly compete in a land market which is polarized between a state and what I would call big market. How on earth can individuals collect? They can't come together collectively to compete. So it needs some orchestration, and that's why we talk about the state being the place promoter.
Dorothy, I want to bring you in from a strategic point of view. Does the current production process constrain the delivery of the kind of strategic planning aims you were talking about? In other words, just take this example of self-build. If there was a more active self-build sector, do you think that would help achieve the kind of place that you want to create in Glasgow and the Clyde Valley? So you were talking about deliverability. What about self-build in relation to deliverability?
Yeah, you would like to think there's potential there to grow interest in self-build, but it has been done. It continues to be done through development plan allocations, which does show that that kind of policy intervention can work. But delivery's tiny, absolutely tiny, and to get momentum around that, I mean, I think it's worthy. It's a worthy aim to try and stimulate that sector, to stimulate diversity, but it would have a long way to go to add up to anything meaningful. Having said that, one single development of that nature in a small community will make a massive contribution, and that truly is community-led development, isn't it? If it works in that way. I mean, the one example I can think of was actually in Neilston. So it's perhaps that scale of community that there's enough development interest, there's enough capacity, there's enough people perhaps to stimulate interest in that kind of product, and it can in the context of that community of that scale, it can make a massive contribution. The areas where it's currently not viable, not economic to build by the private sector, I'm not sure if there would need to be transformative action on scale to make areas like that, and that does need to happen, but to make areas like that acceptable to private investors and on that individual basis.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to just pick one more question that has arisen, and this is really your closing remarks, I guess, but Rob Richardson asked, within our current policy and development context, to what extent are more homes and better places complementary aims? In other words, the opposite of that is, can we have them both, or should policy focus on one or the other? Michaela, can we have better places and more homes, or do we have to choose which the priority is?
No, if I go back to my kind of opening remarks, my Venn diagram of more homes and better places had a massive overlap in the middle with not much either side. And I don't think that the two are mutually exclusive. But what we do need to do, if we're going to achieve both, is stop micromanaging land resources and accept that meeting housing need for the whole community, the wide community, is an essential thing. And if we're going to do that, then we should allocate more land in places that people want to live. And that may be brownfield, it may be greenfield. We may be able to support the brownfields in order to bring them forward. There are a whole lot of things that we can do, but overall we need to, and that was my kind of thought originally, change our attitude towards the delivery of homes. And you know, there are many layers within that, and you know, Tony's point about, you know, one person getting rich because of some ancestral land right and so on is something that sort of, you know, chides all of us really, apart from those people who happen to own the land and so on. But so there are many layers, but the starting point for me is stop micromanaging housing land, identify that it's a real need, and then involve communities in a way that helps communities to be party to development plan decisions. And, you know, as I said, we need to find different ways of doing that, because what we do just now doesn't really work. And whether you co-opt people onto citizen panels or whatever it is, we need to get wide communities involved in those decisions and identify where the homes that we need as a society should go.
Okay, a quick answer from the other three panelists. Can we have both? Tony?
Yeah, I'm going to start by disappointing Steve. Steve, you haven't defeated the argument for land value capture. What you've done is demonstrated that powerful landowners in the past have conspired to defeat public policy objectives. That's what a land strike is. That's what CPO powers are there to deal with too. And I think the issue about self-build is an interesting one, because what do we understand by that? I think too often we understand the kind of grand designs model, when in reality it's a commissioned model of housing delivery that we need to move to. And that requires sites being broken up into smaller chunks so that smaller developers can build bespoke and commissioned housing rather than the speculative, we build it and if you like it, you'll buy it, but it's all there is, so you're going to buy it anyway model that we have at the moment. I mean, we know how we need to do this. We know what we need to deliver. We know that the system we have at the moment isn't delivering what we need. And we're still building houses that are going to have to get retrofitted in the next 20 years to meet carbon reduction targets. We need to deal with those issues, and we need to deal with them very, very quickly. But we also need to not obsess totally about the supply and new housing as being the only or the most important agenda. There are substantial housing issues across the existing stock, both in terms of the extent to which it meets the needs of those people that live in it and the way it functions in that community in its condition. And we need to get a better balance around, is it more houses? Is it enough houses, in fact? Are these the right houses? Are they meeting the needs of people at the moment and in the future? And think about the supply issue in a slightly broader context.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to ask the final two panelists to be quite brief as to whether we can have both more homes and better places, or whether we've got to choose. Dorothy?
Well, I hope so. I suppose that's partly why I chose the career that I chose. I can't help struggling a little bit with Michaela's comment about micromanagement. Perhaps it's micromanagement that will help us achieve the better places, because, and just following on from Tony's points, is use of the word gaming. I mean, it does happen. The system is teed up for that to happen. So when we try and negotiate the little bits of planning gain around affordable housing or Section 75s or the footpath to the neighbouring development, these things get negotiated away out of the system, because that is how the private market operates. So actually, is maybe a bit more micromanagement to achieve place quality. And just briefly, if I may, I've gone on about land and development, but I agree with the points that you made in the opening comments and elsewhere by Steve and Tony. The housing system, the contribution of new builds is actually pretty tiny. We actually build less than 1% of the entire stock of housing stock of Scotland per year, and we need to focus on existing places, existing communities, existing buildings as well. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And Stephen, you have the final and brief word on how ambitious we can be.
Well, I think places and more homes do sit well together. I mean, absolutely. And I'll just go back to my kind of main remark in my opening address, and that was, it's about choice. So good places, we shouldn't be thinking about good places as physical entities, it's about people. And if we get the choice going, then we can get that variety and vitality in our places. We need small interventions that fit. So the more bespoke approaches to all these things. If we do that, I think, yes, you can get more activity through greater participation in small stuff, which helps to make good places.
Okay, thanks to all four panelists. We've had some agreement and thankfully quite a bit of disagreement as well that demonstrates the range of views on these important topics. So thank you all. We're just going to take a couple of minutes break now in the webinar to switch over panels, and we will reconvene in 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you. Second session of the morning, 4 more speakers, and we've asked our 4 new speakers to focus on the question of why local level action is vital in delivering better places. We're going to take the same format as before, give each speaker 3 minutes at the most to make their key points, and then hopefully we're going to have some discussion and pull in some of the questions from the audience. So our first speaker is Matt Baker. Matt is Strategic Director for the Midsteeple Quarter in Dumfries, which is a means for the local community to work to revitalise the town centre by taking control of underused and neglected buildings in the high street. Matt has been a full-time public artist for over 25 years. He's one of the founders and still leads the Stove Network, which is the only community development trust run by artists in the UK. So the great thing is we're going to have maybe a slightly different perspective from Matt. So Matt, you've got three minutes for key points on why local level action is vital. Over to you.
Thanks, David. Okay, so it's maybe useful to start with who we are. So we're a community benefit society in Dumfries undertaking a £25 million regeneration project for our town centre, which is through bringing a high street block into community ownership and developing it ourselves as housing for 200 people, together with 50 units of mixed commercial space, mixed units for commercial space. So I said community benefit society. What is that? It's similar to a traditional old-fashioned building society model in a way that we have 450 members, each of whom are part owners of the project. They elect a board annually, and then the board employs a project team. The project is founded on 6 years of consultation and engagement with local people and other stakeholders. It's a complex and intricate project with multiple benefits, social, economic, and environmental. With the death of the high street, housing has to be part of the future of our town centres. My point here is that places like our towns have a diverse and complex ecosystems of control, responsibility, and accountability. They require complex, nuanced, and above all, locally specific solutions. As a society, we've become addicted to the logic of economies of scale, or one size fits all. Many housing associations have fallen victim to this logic and floated away from the communities that they grew from, and have become instruments of central government policy. In Dumfries and Galloway, our local housing association has been taken over by the Wheatley Group, which is the largest in the UK, and Cunningham have been drafted in by Scottish Government to sort us out, as they say. For successful town centre regeneration, housing needs to be part of a place-based approach to development. By place-based, I mean a truly collaborative approach with local communities as key partners. Only this multi-layered approach can lead to diversity, inclusion, resilience, and a quality of place that delivers the essential well-being and environmental outcomes we need. A significant feature of the kind of resilient places I'm describing has to be community ownership. With this comes a long-term stake in developments, making possible both high-quality environmental buildings and a balance of control and accountability over our places. With community ownership must come community-led housing development. Currently, HAG money in urban locations is only available to registered social landlords. Making this grant support available to community-led developers would be a very simple game changer in the power dynamic of town centres and reimagining their future. The investment in community ownership in the UK budget this week is welcome, but ultimately a centrally administered fund like this does not devolve agency to local level. Decision-making around where investment is targeted must be local for the delicate systems of local interdependency to work, and that requires a properly resourced and functioning local democracy. But maybe I'm straying too far off the topic now, and I'm going to stop.
Okay, thanks very much, Mike. Maybe we will pick up the issue of local democracy in the questions. But at this point, I want to move on to Phil Prentice. Phil is the Chief Officer of Scotland's Town Partnership, the National Programme Director of Scotland's Improvement Districts and Director of UK High Street Task Force. He's passionate about economic development of Scotland, localism, democracy, new economic models, community politics, and world affairs. So I just wonder which of those he's going to focus on in these 3 minutes. Phil, the time is yours.
Thanks very much, David, and good morning. I think the first thing I'm going to focus on is who wrote that biography for me, who in my team. World affairs, what's that all about? Okay, thanks for the opportunity to speak. I'm going to do this a wee bit differently by just bringing it down to a real life situation. 4 or 5 years ago, the Calmac ferry, which traditionally went from Ardrossan to Arran, was up for tender. Normally, it was just a renewal of the existing contract, but South Ayrshire Council quite cheekily wanted that to be moved to Troon. So there had to be a procurement exercise, which ultimately ended up with Ardrossan winning the bid. Ardrossan is a typical post-industrial town, very challenged, no private market interest in housing, lots of social housing that probably needs refreshed. And I remember the leader of the council phoning me, "Did you see the news? Did you see the news, Phil? We've won the ferry contract. Ardrossan's saved." And I said, "Elma, you've already got the ferry. You know, it's not saved. What are we going to do with Ardrossan, moving forward? Because there is no market interest. You've had an urban regeneration company and it's had limited impact. So let's just get everybody around the table and have an honest discussion about Ardrossan." So that honest discussion involved bringing in all of the community planning partners, the key stakeholders, the police, the fire, the councils. And we actually said, look, what are we going to disinvest in? And what are we thinking about investing in? And that led to a really good conversation about how the town actually functions. So the harbour was going to see a big investment with an increased harbour capacity. It had a new medical facility. It had an existing ASDA, which didn't really relate back to the town itself. Then you had the town proper, which was really struggling. We had, just like at most towns, we had depopulated the centre, lots of empty space above the shops, lots of empty shops. The whole thing was very fragile. So we had an honest discussion and we said, right, okay, let's look at this. We've already done the bulk of the work that needs done on the waterfront and the harbour. That's good. We need to build a super secondary school. So there's 2 big schools that are going to have to come together. That's a massive opportunity. And you've already got a budget profile for a new community facility in the middle of the town. So collectively, we zoned the town. we decided that we would knock down some of the redundant retail space, allow a public green space in the heart of the town where people could actually think this is now the centre of our Drossen. We then looked at pushing the existing commercial stroke retail into a more condensed part in the middle of the town with the community facility. The school was going to be built on the South Shore. And then we sat and thought, how does this all work? If we go down the normal system where there's no private market interest, nobody's going to come here. You know, it's all just heavy lift by the public sector. It's all wishy-washy. And then we started to explore new delivery mechanisms. Why do we not open this up to local supply chain? Why don't we look at building residential solutions so we repopulate the town centre and use local supply chain to deliver that? So the people, the young apprentice who doesn't have to sit on unemployment any longer, gets a job as an apprentice, repurposes that former retail unit into a house that ultimately he can move into and rent, and ultimately then start to buy carpets and curtains and broadband and consume, and you start to bring a vibrancy back. So let's stimulate and use that to create a market. Similar story to Dumfries. I remember Matt bringing this down to a housing conference a couple of years back. And I said to everybody, Dumfries is empty. You know, at 6 o'clock at night, it's empty. What about repopulating our high street? Who thinks that's a good idea? Every single hand went up, 100 people in the audience. That says, right, there's a 2-bedroom flat in the town centre at £80,000. Who's going to buy it? Every single hand went down. And this is bringing the argument about better placemaking. We need to create compelling environments in our high streets to repopulate. We need to reduce the inequity in terms of zero-rated new build sprawl in the middle of the farmer's field. And we need to remove the VAT disadvantage of actually repurposing existing buildings within the town centre. But we also need to encourage through policy a more aggressive approach. We don't have any options. I mean, the smarter people had all talked about the systemic issues in the housing market. You know, there has to be changes to policy to actually punish bad behaviour and to reward good behaviour. We all know what needs to be done. We've been talking about it for years and years. And I just can't believe that we're still talking about it today. We need to think about the climate emergency. We need to repopulate our town and city centres. With that repopulation, you've got sustainability, you've got community, you've got consumption. It's the only way we can move forward. And with the pandemic, look at our city centres, which are really struggling. You know, Edinburgh and Glasgow in particular, most of those large corporates aren't moving back to their offices. Don't go down the route of PDR, which has happened down south. Let's think about better quality, thinking about how local people feed into local solutions, a bit like what the Stove's doing, repopulating the town with people who are creative, with more energy, with a vision and a passion. But that's just a good starting point. And I think you'll see other things mushroom around that economic activity over the piece. Shouldn't be left to Matt. Matt's a big part of the equation, but he's been left on his own to deliver this. Others should be helping from Scottish Government level down to local authority level. That's me. Randall.
Great, thanks so much, Phil. We already have questions saying that the event is focusing almost exclusively on urban areas, which was not the intention, and certainly not the intention in inviting Debbie Mackay, who is the Director of Planning Community Engagement at Savills. And as well as her expertise in large-scale master planning and strategic reviews, she's particular knowledge of rural planning and has written reports on that topic, both for the Scottish Land Commission and from the Scottish Government. So, Debbie, very interested to hear what you have to say in your 3 minutes about why local action is vital in delivering better places. Over to you, Debbie.
Thank you, David, and Cash and the Scottish Land Commission for this opportunity. So today I've been challenged to distill what we've learned and observed from 2 research studies, Rural Planning Policy to 2050 for the Scottish Government and the role of land in enabling new housing supply in rural Scotland for the Scottish Land Commission, into 3 main points and 3 minutes to address this question, why local level action is vital in delivering better places. So my distillation is that where delivering housing and great places in rural areas is concerned, the challenge is as follows. National and volume house builders do not operate in rural areas. The economics can be challenging and market failures commonplace. It's hugely complicated to deliver new rural places, and there's a wide variation in skills, resource and awareness across the board. And all of this can lead to relationship and trust breakdown. So what we need to address these challenges are the following. Local fine-grained diagnosis of need, such as local housing needs surveys, local collaboration across all sectors to diagnose that need and then to prescribe the remedies, and local action supported by national policy, funding that's fairly distributed to rural areas, and legislation to apply those remedies. One of the ways we saw this done most effectively when we did our studies was through the Applecross Community Land Use Plan. Not a perfect process, but one we can learn a lot from. And in the Applecross case, some key features included a fine-grained local housing survey by a housing trust to establish and evidence need and demand. That then supported the case for housing being made to the planning authority and the landowner involved and grant-giving bodies. So the formation of a neutral forum was also critical to ease communication by all parties and overcome a history of distrust. The production of a community land use plan where the community, in partnership with the public authorities and the landowner, decided where it was best for housing and other land uses to be located. The use of neutral facilitation to develop the community land use plan was important in this particular situation, and in this case it was PAS, Planning Aid Scotland, who led that. And critically, the adoption of the community land use plan as a material planning consideration by Highland Council gave it considerable weight in the planning process. So while the process may not have been perfect and the Applecross community is still on that journey, we felt there was a lot to learn from this and the other case studies in our reports about how working at the most local of levels, where the needs are deeply understood and lived every day and made explicit, makes it hard for those who might otherwise obstruct new development to continue to stand in the way. It also highlighted the absolute essential nature of collaborative approaches and the need to get all key parties to the table by hook or by crook. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Debbie. I think we're getting a good theme here about local action, about the importance of community. And maybe I'm realizing that one size does not fit all. So no doubt those will be picked up in the discussion. I want to move on to Shaheena Din. Shaheena is National Project Manager for Empty Homes at Shelter Scotland. She's worked at Shelter in various roles since 2009 and is heavily involved in encouraging and influencing local authorities to bring private sector empty homes back into use. So the floor is yours. Shaheena, you've sort of your 3 minutes to make your opening remarks.
Thank you. Nice to see you all today. So the coronavirus pandemic has led to an almost 16% increase in privately owned empty homes. So there are now approximately 47,000 long-term empties in Scotland. And these are homes that have lain empty for 6 months or more that are reported on council tax records. So we were anticipating some increase in the number of long-term empty homes, but a near 16% rise is really significant. The pandemic has led to more homes becoming empty and more homes remaining empty in most local authorities in Scotland. More worryingly, the full impact of COVID-19 on the number of empty homes is still emerging, and the figures may continue to rise sometime. So why do homes become empty? Well, usually it's life circumstances that cause homes to become empty. Somebody's died, somebody's gone into long-term care. But often they remain empty due to economic features of an area. So the Scottish Empty Homes Partnership agree that local action is vital, and we call for every council in Scotland to have a dedicated empty homes officer. These officers have made and continue to make an immense contribution to bringing homes back into use. They helped to return over 1,400 properties in 2019-20. And they've got an essential role to play in tackling the rise in empty properties that we've seen this year. We also want every council in Scotland to have an empty home strategy, and we want this strategy to focus on options to bring homes back into use, but we also want the strategy to include how to reduce the numbers of empty homes remaining empty over 12 months or more. This is because we know that the longer homes remain empty, the harder it is to bring them back into use. We want councils to recognise finally, as my third point, that empty homes are an asset on our doorstep. They have a vital part to play in revitalising local economies after COVID-19 and should be a cornerstone of post-pandemic recovery plans. Empty homes work can restore confidence in property market, help to regenerate communities, sustain fragile communities, and there's a number of multitude benefits as well as contributing to housing supply. So I think that sometimes what I'm trying to say in a nutshell is that often there's lots of different policies, and an empty homes officer in a council can go away and try and do as much as they can to bring homes back into use, but without that joined up cohesive approach, it's not going to, deal with the challenges that we've got. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, and thanks to all our panelists for being quite succinct in their initial remarks. Interestingly, our panelists are coming from perspectives that are not government perspectives. None of you are currently working for, or maybe have worked for local government or central government, but are coming in different ways. So I'm going to go straight to what I think is a very interesting question from someone who says this is their first housing event. I may be wrong, but where are the tenants' voices in this conversation? All I can hear is talk about buildings and land from people with vested interest. Maybe that referred to the first session, I don't know. Where is the community and tenant voice? So I guess I'm wanting our panelists just to say something about the importance of how the agenda is driven, not by the providers of housing, but perhaps by the users of housing and the users of places. And I think that's probably, we need to say a bit more about that. And I think this is a session to do so. So Phil, would you like to just kick us off on how we can get more user voices, community tenants and elsewhere into this debate?
Yeah, I think it's a really valid point. Just picking up on a point Debbie had made, I think that hyper-local housing needs and demand analysis, the really granular discussion about what exactly does this community need moving forward is critical, and very often doesn't happen. It's very formulaic, it doesn't engage people. So there's maybe something that we could learn from the rural approach in an urban context that would actually help develop potentially even new product, because we haven't built anything for our parents' generation for a long, long time, and we have the fastest aging demographic in Europe. We haven't built anything for young people who don't want to be tied down to the existing housing market. There's new products there to be had, but we need to talk to people and we need to drive down to what that local solution would be. That can be done. I mean, we've spent 6 months now, probably a bit longer. We published a new future for Scotland's towns as a provocation to the Scottish Government about a month ago. And we're going to work closely with them to try and come up with a government response by the autumn, which will ultimately become a new action plan for delivery. And critical to all of that is repopulating our centres, mainly because of the climate emergency, but also making use of some of the redundant built environment that we've already got. We spoke to groups that had never had a voice in this debate before. We spoke to migrant populations, we spoke to the single mums, the unemployed, the people with mental health and drug addictions. We spent a long time speaking to disability groups, inclusion groups, because we wanted to hear from the unheard voices. Big proportion of our society that just get left to the side. And tenants and residents associations and social landlords, all of these people are critical to our recovery. I think the pandemic has shone a light on just how vital housing is in our society and how potentially it can help rebuild a much more resilient and fairer Scotland and greener Scotland moving forward. I think it has to become part of the process moving forward, that local communities are spoken to, are talked to, are listened to. They have to be consulted, because it's only then that we'll come up with better solutions around housing that are fit for purpose, in the right place at the right time, and speak to what people need. So yeah, it's a very, very valid point. The tenants and residents very often get overlooked, and we must move away from housing as being seen as an investment. It needs to become a commodity, something different that we use at different points in our time, like Steve Tolson had pointed out in Germany and Scandinavia. You know, at the minute we have a very bland system which developers have given us. We need to make that much more colourful and more options within all of that. And without talking to people and listening to people, we'll never get there.
Very good. Does any of the other panelists want to address the user point of view as to whether users and communities tend to get forgotten in the whole process? Okay, Matt, and then Shaheena.
Okay. Well, I think Debbie brought up the point about local place plans, and I think that's absolutely vital going forward in terms of that connect between local government and central government and people. But I think, you know, I mean, just to use the example of how we've worked, the work that we've been doing has been entirely driven by our local community. So we've done six years of detailed consultation work with our local population. So typically we'll be doing three events a week, and we classically work with the same kind of format of like, what is the future? What is the right future for our town, and how could you be involved in making that future happen? We've on a typical year, we work with 150 different community groups, and we involve over 10,000 people in those conversations about the way our town, and that is what has developed the Midsteeple Quarter project. It's not.
Can I just come in and ask you a question? Do you find the public sector in the broader sense supportive of the approach you're taking, or more destructive of the approach you're taking?
Well, I think that, I mean, that can't be a one-size-fits-all answer, because I can only speak to my personal experience with the Gallery Council. I think there is a general resistance there around power and control. The local authorities have been used to being the only show in town and being the people who, they complain all the time about the people that folks say, oh, the council will fix it, but they don't really like the idea that somebody else is going to fix it. They like being the ones that are, well, they've become addicted to being the ones in control. And I think that, what we need to be doing is investing in core infrastructure for emerging community groups, and that's risky. We talked about risk in the last session. There will be initiatives that will fail, but you need to put, the risk is that you're constantly talking about volunteering policy, and you cannot develop serious initiatives out of volunteering. So it's an important starter, but you need to put in initial core investment in order for those groups to have the agency to then be able to develop meaningful partnerships with the other players in the game. And that's what we're finding now. I mean, I have a very strong relationship with the leader of our council. Will ring me up and talk about what are we going to do in our town centre, and you know, and I take that back to the people that I'm working for, you know, and so it is possible, but they also, and the local authorities understand from a financial point of view that community groups have got access to different funding pots that they can't access. So there is potential for amazing partnership between the funds that are accessible to the local authorities, but those that do it differently, that are accessible to communities, and putting it together is a very powerful way of starting a project.
Shaheena, do you want to come in at this point? We have an associated question, which is, what steps do panelists think would produce better community involvement and, more importantly, good community outcomes? What about this perspective outside the public sector, because you stand outside the public sector, of actually making a difference and getting things done? Do you want to throw in a few remarks on how you feel on it?
I think most recently we recognised that actually not speaking to owners and not understanding their perspective of why homes remain empty was massive, because actually there's a perception that homes remain empty and people are maybe waiting for prices to sky high and rocket, when essentially when we talk to our owners of empty properties, they're stuck. A lot of them are stuck and they don't know what to do. And we did some quantitative analysis. We sent out surveys to owners that contact our advice service, and did some research with owners that way. And we asked them what they needed. In fact, in our conference, we recently had an owner that talked about her own personal journey when bringing the empty property back into use. And following that, we're looking to do a bit of qualitative analysis to sort of think about what are the solutions that we can encourage from government at a policy level to support owners to bring homes back into use that are actually financially stuck with a property that nobody wants to rent, or stuck with a property because the property upstairs is empty. You know, there's so many different things.
Good. Okay, Debbie, your thoughts on these issues?
Yeah, I think I absolutely endorse everything that the others have said on this, and I think that, yeah, I sometimes cringe at my early days as a young planning officer in an implementation section, which was mentioned earlier by Dorothy, at how cavalier we were about communities and how arrogant we were, really. And your career humbles you, and it certainly humbled me in that regard, of you know, just the sheer power and ability of a community to do what it needs to do about the things it cares about. And I think my lessons from public sector life were that if I could go back now, I would just train myself and everybody around me to regard everybody out there as your client. And that's been a big lesson from the private sector the last decade. And the private sector has been, you know, the way you treat your clients, you treat them properly. You think about them all the time. You look after your clients. And I would like to go back. And I think I did change. I think I did change throughout those 10 years. But I'd love to, that's the thing. I think the public sector has to get into its head that we're servants. We serve our communities. We try to do the best for our communities. We listen to our communities. We treat them like clients who have opinions and who are highly invested and have more skin in the game than we will ever have in that particular place. And we give them that respect in that place and the control they deserve to make a difference in their communities.
Okay, I think we're coming to the end of this session, but I think we've highlighted not simply why local level action is vital, but why communities and users as part of that are vital. So thanks everyone for your contributions. Time is moving on very quickly, and so I'm sorry we've not been able to address more of the questions that people have posted. But we're going to again take a short break whilst the current speakers switch off, and we will then move on to the next session. So we'll start the next session in about a couple of minutes' time. Thank you. That's good if it doesn't do. Oh, there you are.
Here I am.
That's great.
Yes.
Good. Let's. We've got just over half an hour left, so we shall move into the final session, which is now focusing on the role of policy in delivering practical change. And maybe we might pick up some of the comments in the previous two sessions. So again, we have 4 speakers. First of all, I'll do the same sort of thing. I'll introduce the speakers and I will ask them 3 minutes for some opening remarks, and then we will try and have some discussion between the speakers. So first of all, I'm going to welcome Henry McLeish, best known as the former First Minister of Scotland, 2 previous careers, one as a professional footballer, but far more importantly, as an urban planner. And Henry, more recently, in all his writing and speaking, is now also serving as patron of Planning Aid for Scotland. So maybe Back to the Future, I don't know. But Henry, from your perspective, would you like to just give us a view on what you think policy can be doing in delivering the practical change we've been thinking about? And the floor is yours for 3 minutes.
Well, thanks very much, David. And I think I'm the only one with only one name, so I think I'm glad you suggested I had a second name. It seemed a bit strange to kick off with. But look, I had the opportunity very, very early on in public life to be both a planning officer with one of the old districts in Scotland and also the chairman of the planning committee in the other one. And it seemed to me at that point that much of the discussion that we had and discussions we're having today is essentially about power, about intervention, and this really important question of the common good or the public interest. And I want to make 3 quite specific points. That when we talk about place we should put it in the context of folk workplace. This was the trilogy of Patrick Geddes 100 years ago. It was the idea that powered the question of the Garden City movement, subsequently the new towns. And all of that was really about the public good and how you could take the idea of people, work and environment and try and bring them together. I'm not convinced that we've maintained that kind of early momentum. And I think we have a situation now where the Geddes idea, reading books like Jane Jacobs, The Life and Death of Great American Cities, you know, we have to put much more emphasis on place, because I often think it's an afterthought and not integral to our original thinking. But in the mood of the Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament, then I think we can make some progress on that idea. I think the second point relates to the public good itself. I believe that in many areas and on many issues, the balance between the public good and private gain is tilting too far towards the private gain issue. And what I mean by that is essentially to think that we do need somebody who can not only mediate in a way, not only regulate, but actually control what is happening in the built environment. And for that to happen, I think we need to have planning being rehabilitated as a sound concept, and not, as we've seen in England, a concept which is constantly undermined about controlling, interfering, Big Brother getting on involved in people's life. And not only to get planning rehabilitated as an idea, but also planning authorities in Scotland, for example, to have much more significant powers, not only to land manage, but to actually place, the idea of place planning to be given a proper perspective. And I think, thirdly, we're talking about more homes and better places. We're not going to build less homes and worse places. And it seems to me that in the title and the description of what we're doing, we need to look at the idea of who doesn't have a home. And I think homelessness, for example, has not figured greatly today. Maybe that's by the nature of the discussion. But it seems to me a society that whose welfare state was formed in the ideas of Beveridge, we now have a situation where we still see housing far too often as a capital asset, as a market asset, looking at return, when in fact we should be looking at social need. And I don't like the idea that 30,000 homes in Scotland at any one time, groups, families are homeless. And so therefore I think there's a danger of missing our priorities when we look at some of the more grandiose schemes. And finally, just David, on the point that public participation was the big issue when I was at university. We're getting into all of that. We've come on from that, but let's not pretend that by having the process of public intervention, participation by people, that we're going to necessarily improve the quality of the built environment that we see around us. So a great deal of debate has to take place, not only on the practicalities, but I think the underlying philosophies of where we are and where we want to be.
Thanks very much indeed, Henry. I think that's quite a challenge for us all, because you seem to be saying that policy can deliver, but it needs to be a slightly different kind of policy than we have at the moment. So no doubt that's going to be picked up as this session proceeds. And I'm going to move on to Archie Rintle, who was Chief Value for Scotland, was RIS Scotland Chairman, but has much broader interest than valuation, and makes the connection between valuation, his expertise in compensation and compulsory purchase, and into placemaking. And so, for example, Archie was one of the two authors of the recent Scottish Land Commission paper on public interest-led development, that I suspect resonates a little bit with some of the suggestions Henry was making. So, Archie, policy. What can policy deliver? What kind of policy do we need to deliver maybe what we're not delivering? So 3 minutes for your opening remarks, please.
Thank you, David, and good morning, everyone. Well, I think you mentioned public interest-led development, and I think that's the first point I would like to make. I think a public interest-led development model as prime mover in larger developments would be of considerable benefit. It would work in partnership with local authorities and local communities. It would do the master planning, develop the infrastructure, acquire the land, reserve areas for the various house types and tenures, including things like cooperative housing, self-build, which was mentioned earlier in the discussions, custom build, housing for older people, affordable housing, all of these areas for which there is an undersupply at the moment. It could also do things like reserve areas for development by SME builders who have serious difficulty in getting a look in development as well as getting funding. Essentially, it would deliver homes and, more importantly, communities at the pace required to meet the current unmet demand, because that's one of the problems we have at the moment. Developers don't develop in order to meet the requirements of the community. They develop at the pace which suits their commercial interests. And that's not always the same as the interests of the community in which they're constructing. These are things which can be done. I mean, Ireland, for example, set up a couple of years ago its land delivery unit, which basically does much of what I have said. RICS proposed this as a housing land delivery agency, 7 years ago. That was followed by a land reform review group, of which David was a member, with its proposed Housing Land Corporation. And even more recently, Homes for Scotland have suggested a national delivery agency. So this is an idea which really does work. It works in Ireland, it works on the continent, and it could work here. Now, my second point, I think we need to change the emphasis in planning from a focus on numbers to the creation and delivery of great places to live. Now, NPF 4, for example, is a really good aspirational document, but I think it will need to do more than it states to move away from the emphasis on numbers. As an example, like Henry, I live in Fife. In my area of Fife in Dunfermline, there are 9,000 houses allocated in a local development plan in the Dunfermline area. Almost half of these have no work started on site. This is in an area with a population of just under 60,000. So that 9,000 allocated units rather allows for a 35% or so increase in population in the area. But in spite of this, developers still get planning permission on appeal to reporters for unallocated sites because of a supposed shortfall in housing supply, contrary to the wishes of the community, the wishes of the planning officials, and the wishes of the elected representatives. So we're finding that good local development plans, which have been developed by the authority and by the communities over a period of years, are frustrated by the planning system itself. The third point I'd like to raise is something which Stephen mentioned, providing more housing suitable for older people. Developers prefer to build family housing, but 2/3 of us are in 1 or 2 person households. The fastest growing demographic is people over 65, like myself, currently 19% of the population, but that's expected to grow to 25% of the population of Scotland within 25 years, with over 85s being the fastest growing demographic within that. Yet developers, for example, don't build single-storey houses suitable for older people to move down to, a point Stephen was making earlier. If you look back at the 1980s, 14% of all new houses were single-storey. In the late 90s, it was down to 8%, and now for the last 10, 12 years, it's been 1 to 2%. So at a time when single-storey houses would be very helpful in allowing older people with perhaps minor mobility problems to move out of the larger 2-storey houses, they just are not there for them to buy. And planning authorities have no means of requiring developers to build a proportion of their houses as single-storey. At present, for example, there's no guidance within the Scottish Government's HNDA guidance note that local authorities should investigate the need for single-storey housing, and most don't. So they have no evidence base which they can use to convince a reporter that single-storey housing is necessary within an area. So they have no control of that. So we do need, I think, to look at that Honda guidance and to see whether we need to change that. And we've also, of course, in the private sector, got the demise of McCarthy and Stone, which has exacerbated the issue of private sector provision for housing for older people. And we really need to do more to encourage that, because in a decade or two, we could very well have a serious shortage. So those are my 3 points, David. Thanks.
Okay, Archie, thanks very much indeed. Patrick Flynn is our next speaker. Patrick heads up Glasgow City Council's housing regeneration services, and he's been closely involved in a whole series of schemes, including the Lauriston Transformation Regeneration Area and the Glasgow Commonwealth Games Village. And I guess he's going to tell us whether he thinks Glasgow is already undertaking public interest-led development, but also maybe what some of the obstacles are for achieving what you want to achieve in Glasgow. So, Patrick, we're interested to hear your experience and the wider lessons of it. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. There is no Scottish housing market, so the Glasgow City region is a housing market, and folk have to understand, I think, how different housing markets are. And I can only really speak for the city region that I operate in. I'd like to echo Mr. McLeish's, Patrick Geddes note, people, place and money. So the policy development for people, place and money nationally have to be aware of the interface, because I'm old enough to remember when regeneration was called urban renewal, which consisted mainly of capital investment in housing, which was wasted if there isn't appropriate policies and strategies for community participation, more than that, community control, and for economic development at the same time. You're quite right, I'm going to claim that we are the public sector agency. I used to work for a national housing delivery agency, and I can absolutely assure colleagues that it was a very good agency, but it definitely is not a silver bullet for our problems. I am a practitioner, so I'm not involved in direct policy development, and my place in the development wheel, I remember my training, is to advise policy writers and ministers eventually about our strategy and our delivery and how it works, and then that can inform future policy. So my key interests as a practitioner are the local authority strategy, which is there to help deliver the policy, and as important for me as a practitioner, the action plan that comes out of that. So 2019 Act has changed again planning in the country and made it more development orientated. And I think it's key that the strategic development frameworks and the local development frameworks within those plans have action plans that work. And the reason why that's really important is that development's hard. It's really, really hard. And for a city like ours, we need to coalesce both the policy, the strategies, and the funding around development, so that, for instance, we've got 46 sites on the ground just now with our partners in the Housing Association movement. We have 66 active housing associations in the city, and they give us a fairly unique but really powerful engagement, participation with local communities, community control, because they are partners, they're not, they have money, basically. So our programme and the wider programme needs us as a local authority to bring the land, and we often have to assemble that land. And the land, if you open it up, needs money, because as one of the world's preeminent post-industrial cities, every time you open up a site in our fair city, you find something really interesting, and not in a good way. We've been left a charming city centre as a Victorian city centre as a legacy, but some of the land we've got is very difficult to develop, as people can imagine. That's one example. We have title issues. We have plethora of issues in order to assemble land to make it shovel ready, as they say. So those 46 that we've got on just now, and our 6-year programme for affordable housing is the sites are available, but the land, developing the land is difficult, and it can be expensive, which brings you around to money. And the key policy driver for affordable housing is gap funding in our city region. So we've been really lucky over the last 5 years, but people have to understand that without affordable housing grant, the housing strategy's 50 actions that we have and are approved by committee every year can't really be met. So it's a wee bit of a plea that the practicalities around policy development are understood by the people who write national policy, so that infrastructure funding and the rest are coherent. One last thing is climate emergency. It is the #1 issue for housing development coming up. And we have a major retrofit programme and a major amended new build programme to take into consideration the exigencies of the climate emergency. Number of examples, we have to plan our surface water management in order to deliver our housing. So prime example would be the Canal Strategy and the investment ourselves in Scottish Canal. Well, Scottish Canal have helped in terms of the Smart Canal, which allows us to develop over 3,000 houses in the north of the city. It would have required £45 million worth of pipes in areas that we don't have under the old way of dealing with surface water. That's one example. We're in partnership with Spain and another in order to make sure that the capacity and the systems available there as well. So real practical issues that may well need public money, that will need a coherent infrastructure policy in order for us to deal with it. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks very much, Patrick. I'm going to move straight on to Neil Martin from the private sector. Neil is land manager at Campion Homes. He's previously worked for Springfield Properties and for Homes of Scotland and in planning consultancy. So I think he's maybe bringing a slightly different perspective to the issue on how policy can deliver practical change. Neil, you've got sort of 3 minutes to your key points.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thank you for the invite to present. So yeah, hopefully I can give a slightly different perspective from what people have heard today. I'd also add that in a previous life I was also a planning officer at Regional Council and subsequent Perth and Ross Council. So I've seen a bit. I think what I would like to do is almost pose 3 questions for people to kind of think about. First of all, designing streets, great ideas. Placemaking, absolutely want to do that. 20-minute neighbourhoods is, I think, the new interpretation of Geddes' original ideas. These are all things that we all want to do. When I put a housing layout into planning authority, one of the first things I get back is, how does a 12-metre long bin lorry get around it? So I've got to then say to the architect, right, redesign, we've got to get a 12-metre bin lorry around this. And he's only allowed to use forward gears as well. I've got a single point of access into a relatively modest size site, a single point of vehicle access into a relatively modest size site. Policy says we have to have more than one point of access. There's a footpath there, there's a bike cycle lane there. It has to be vehicular access. So where are we going with trying to overcome a car-dependent society if we've got to have 2 points of access at all times into a site? Where's the joined up thinking in trying to bring forward better design? I think the second point is to touch on the economic aspects of the current housing market as it currently stands. Let's take a theoretical site, maybe one of Archie's sites in Dunfermline, which I know quite well. It's been sitting in the local plan for a number of years. It's finally coming to the market. Great, right. What are the developed contributions? In Dunfermline just now, you're looking at around about £25,000 per market home. That's for schools, strategic road improvements, open space, public art. I've got site costs, build costs, sales costs, fees, and of course a profit. And all I've got left is 15% of the value of that new home to pay for all that and deal with industrial legacies on the site, under the site, whatever it might be. So we're already trying to squeeze a finite pot. What I can't do is put a premium on design. I can't put a premium on to energy efficiency. I'd like to, but I can't because that's where the market is. We see house buyers coming in, new house buyers coming in. I need to have 3 bedrooms. That's the driving force, 3 bedrooms, or actually it's 4 bedrooms now because they want 3 bedrooms plus a home study because of the work from home change. I cannot put a value on placemaking, and mortgage lenders don't put a value on placemaking. How do we fund what's being asked of new house building? It's maybe a point that Patrick's touched on in terms of the public investment. I think the final point to touch on, I think, is something that Henry mentioned in the intro about public benefit. How do we understand public benefit? What I do is I deliver new homes. It's new homes that our communities need. That in its basic level is a public interest. Those are private homes and they are affordable homes. But we also deliver investment in schools, in roads, and open space and biodiversity. It was Home for Scotland who did some very clever calculations on what an average new home will deliver beyond a new home. £45,000 of capital spend per house, 4 full-time equivalent jobs supported, £9,000 on average of national tax income, land building transaction tax, and then annually it will keep delivering about £1,000 of tax of council tax. These are all of value. These are all of public interest. How do we get these aspects, the positive aspects of house buildings, recognised by all stakeholders? How do we scale up the idea that Debbie mentioned in the previous session? How do we scale that up to a Dunfermline-wide level to get the support we need to deliver new homes?
Okay, that's great. Thanks so much. I mean, that in a nutshell sort of summarizes a lot of the problems that are there in the current model that we have of delivering new homes and places in Scotland. I'm just looking at the questions that have been asked. There's one that's quite a long question, but I'm just going to take the first sentence of it. The question then goes on and puts more specific detail, but I'm not going to follow that. The question is, does Scotland really want to do something radical here? So we've got a few minutes left for this webinar, but if you think about the way that we are currently doing things, that's the way we've probably been doing things for the best part of 30, 40 years. When we switch from one model of delivery to another model of delivery, is it or is it not time to make a major switch and do something radical? In policy terms, what are the dangers of doing that? What are the possible gains of doing that? Archie, would you like just to kick us off on that? Is it time to change gear once again after having a sort of similar kind of model for quite a period of time, or is that too much of a danger of doing that?
Thanks, David. No, I really don't think it's a danger. I think it is a necessity. As you say, we have been following the current housing delivery model for about the last 40 years or so, and we have ended up in a housing crisis. We have ended up with various types of housing which are simply not produced by the market and have not been produced by the public sector either. So I think we do need to change how we do things completely. And I think it would be very beneficial if we went over to the continental model, where the municipalities in Germany and Netherlands and many other countries on the continent are much more actively involved in development for housing. Vauban, for example, is an obvious example, where the municipality did the master planning, the acquisition, the infrastructure, and worked with various bodies to provide co-housing. So these are things that have been done elsewhere and could be done here to provide the right mix of houses and right tenures. And it doesn't exclude the major house builders either. If we're doing a large public interest-led development, there's a big place there for private sector house builders to build the sort of houses they do now, because we need those houses, but we also need other types of houses in another 10 years, which are not produced at the moment. And we won't get that without a step change in how we look at how we deliver public housing in Scotland. So yes, I think we do need to look at a new housing model.
Okay, thanks. Neil, I mean, you've been quite critical of the practicalities of the current model and where it falls down. I guess the question for you is whether the house building industry would want a radical change in the model. And it doesn't necessarily need to be the radical change that Archie's suggesting. There's a radical change in a different direction going on south of the border, for example. Is the housing building industry comfortable, despite all the criticisms it makes, with the current model, or would it want to see something radically different in terms of the way housing is delivered?
I think at one level, nobody likes change, so there's that inertia to overcome. But in some respects, I don't care who I buy land off of. So if I buy land off of the local authority and they've gone in and de-risked it, then great. You know, I'll give you a greenfield rate for that land because that's what it's worth. Because you've gone in, you've spent the money, you have dealt with contamination, you've dealt with the access issues, you've got everything secured and ready to go. So if that's the model, then great. But I don't know if local authorities have the, and this isn't a criticism of local authorities, it's an observation, I don't know if they have the capacity to do that yet, and how they actually scale up to achieve that capacity to be able to do an exercise in land assembly and therefore subsequent delivery. So if they can do it, then great, because we'll buy land off anyone. We're not fussy, and it'll help us because it'll be de-risked.
Okay, Patrick, your views on whether we need a radically different model from your experience in Glasgow, radically different model across Scotland in terms of the way housing is delivered, or are we generally comfortable with the way things are?
Well, change is a constant, and the funding environment's changed after the last budget, for instance, and the climate change emergency makes things very different. The retrofit programme will have to accelerate greatly, and there's a major skills issue there. We're down to 2 contractors for the kind of work that's required for that. But just on the last caller, again, I'd just emphasise that local authorities are different, the housing markets are different, and they have different pressures, different values in the land. We do act as I'll give examples. So the Games Village was 700 units, Sighthill 1,000, Hamilton Hills 600 and some. Portland Dallas have a partnership with Big, and Canals is going to be 700-800, Cavaliers is 800. The TRAs are 5,000, power station site in Kilmarnock 634. We've got a programme for 10,000 houses around the city centre in the 10-minute walk into the city centre. So there's the Inner East Meat Market, Carlton Village, which is Wheatley Group's biggest ever single development. So it goes on. We've put 17,000 affordable housing on the ground since we transferred our stock, invested in it, whatever. But the vast majority of those have been on sites that the council have had acquired one way or another. The supply of land isn't a huge issue. It's the nature of the land and assembling it. And we have to understand that it's a 20-year programme. So Dover Street went on last week, 60 odd units. It's 14 years to get that on site. The minute we got the CPO finished, then with the Japanese knotweed came in, and on and on. So real development issues. But it's on now, thankfully, before I go. It's one of those ones, let's have a party, it's on site. So we do act as the developer, if you will, up to a stage, and then pass it on to the builder. And we can continue to do that. It's increasingly difficult, one, to get the skills, because it's difficult for local authorities to attract lawyers and surveyors, building and quantity, and other professionals, geotech and the rest, to allow us to do it. So I've had to do site health, for instance, in a very different way than I did the Games Village. The Games Village was a council team in the main, in partnership with Site Legacy. But the site health, it's me with contracts with private companies on a lot of occasions. So
okay, we're going to have to work together, but thanks for those insights. Henry, I'm going to come to you. I mean, we're nearly at the end of this webinar, but I guess you were arguing for that radical change. I think what I want to push you on is, what are the barriers that exist to getting that radical change in policy, and how can we try and overcome the barriers? In other words, why haven't we had the radical change, and what do we need to do to get the radical change, rather than just asking you to repeat your case for the radical change?
Well, Scotland is capable of radical change in the sense that, we contributed greatly to the Enlightenment. We've done a great deal in terms of innovation. We've taken the hardships of early days in terms of public health policy. We've created valuable services that exist just now. But I think there's a reluctance to change because, in my view, there is a role for the market in housing, of course there is, but it's become too dominant. And Neil's right to say that, the pressures on local authorities, they've lived through 10 years of austerity. They, in my view, are being diminished daily by outgivings from Westminster. So I think there's too many parts of this to say, look, it's an easy thing to do, but I think we've got to be bolder. I want to be us to be more European. I want to be a perspective where we don't frown upon housing that is not owner occupied. I dislike the term social housing. I thought we had built ourselves away from all of that. So radicalism is needed. We should learn from Europe, Scandinavian countries, Germany, whatever. But I also think there is a quantum leap required to say that there are areas where the market should not be involved. But there are areas where the market should be assisting. And so I'd like to think that in local government and in central government, there's much more confidence. There's a kind of rebuilding of confidence, a rebuilding of a different future. And when you consider climate change, and we still don't have effective policies to insulate properties, that's ridiculous. We have a green wave supposed to be emerging, but again, is the government serious at Westminster? Because that's largely where the cash comes from. So therefore, bits and pieces, David, but on the other hand, it's a state of mind. Scotland has always been a state of mind, and I think now we need to look forward, look at the weaknesses, look at the strengths, build on the strengths, and see where that takes us.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for, I think that's a really key challenge at the end of this morning. We've covered an awful lot, I think, in a short space of time. So can I thank our four speakers in this last session? Can I thank all the speakers in the whole of the morning, and those of you who have asked questions via that function. I'm sorry we haven't been able to address more of them, but I don't think we've been short of discussion. So can I finally say that I hope you will continue to follow the work of CASH and the Scottish Land Commission, both organisations. You can sign up for regular newsletters to see what the organisations are doing in pushing this agenda forward. So that's the end.